Hello, Camp Files viewers. This is Aidan Jonah, editor-in-chief of the Camp Files. I want to bring a story that may have popped up in your feed, but there is a whole different dimension to it that I believe has not been explored properly at all. So let's get into this now. So the first thing that people would already mostly be aware of is, of course, that you have Evan Dyer, the favorite right-wing anti-communist lapdog of U.S. empire, platforming these right-wing anti-communist Cuban-Canadians who are playing the victim and claiming that they are targets of harassment and intimidation by the Cuban government in retaliation for their anti-government stances. Now, one of the interesting elements here is that, because it comes in relation to drugs and allegations of trafficking, one very interesting point, and it's not saying definitively that he did it, it was Maximo Morales. What's very fascinating, of course, and I say fascinating and it's a terrible thing, is that he did trafficking of cocaine purchased from the Medellin cartel. And he did that to actually fund the operations of anti-Castro opposition, including, the article says, particularly the purchase of land, arms, and equipment for training camps in the Florida Everglades. So he tries to just brush over this Mr. Morales guy, just saying that he did his time, reintegrated. You know, I'm just going to say it straight up. If you had, let's just say, a Russian Canadian who was, trafficking drugs to, let's say, support Russia's SMO, that person would be punished so severely, wouldn't get a pardon, and, their life would be made hell. But this guy just gets an easy way through life. He gets a pardon, and then he's conveniently, he's able to own a number of businesses, get into real estate, and the guy has an easy life, right? Just to give you an idea of how these things work. Of course, the article itself, really, it's hysterical nonsense. There's investigations, there's deep dives into it. The Cuban government has to protect itself from drug trafficking. Like I said, it's not definitively clear if they actually were part of such a network, so I'm not alleging that in the first place. But this all comes down to this idea of the Cuban government supposedly targeting dissidents. And it's just to give you an idea, right, of how this anti-communist bend really comes in. You have the son of Maximo Morales. There's this quote I want to read from him. "I wish the government would do more to protect Canadian citizens and residents who escaped dictatorships like the one in Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, China, North Korea, Iran," he said. And this comes down to all of this core anti-communism, these core, enemy states. So where this comes in now, in terms of the broader anti-Cuban government faction in Canada, those elements are actually seeking sanctions on Cuba, and they are calling for regime change. I wrote about this back in November of 2022. There's this Democratic Spaces group trying to get Magnitsky sanctions implemented against officials and entities, which, let's be real here, would be if that had have gone through, it would have been the start of deeper and deeper sanctions targeting the Cuban people in a more broader sense. This was just meant to be just the start. You also have, of course, that same Democratic Spaces group actually being involved in the push to outright shift diplomatic recognition to regime change groups, anti-Cuban government ones, under the guise of, quote, pro-democracy protesters. It was Democratic Spaces Director Michael Lima who made sure that he wrote that speech, and it was delivered by Senator Husakos, in March of 2022. So where these diasporas come in, right, is unfortunately, just as with the Cuban-Canadian diaspora, realistically, the majority is anti-government. Unfortunately, the pro-government folks are not the majority. And it's the same way for these people that came from Hong Kong before it was fully reunified with China. Now, you had about 335,000 people from Hong Kong, when it was under British control, move to Canada between 1984 and 1997. And wouldn't you know it, these people are actively serving as the useful idiots for pushing the Yellow Peril 2.0 narrative. And I called this back in 2021. You have these right-wing anti-communist diaspora members claiming to be victims of silencing tactics and harassments. And, when the Cuban diaspora anti-government elements claim it's, Cuban government harassment. And when the Hong Kong diaspora folks, they claim that it's intimidation from quote-unquote CCP agents. And, what they really share is that they don't have evidence to back up these claims. In the case of Hong Kong ones, it's really damaging because there have also been many years actually pushing the claim of Chinese infiltration in Canada, and that helped kind of create a bit of the atmosphere, right, where more people would believe the CSIS really led Chinagate hysteria campaign that's whipped up this new McCarthyist atmosphere. Just giving an idea of how these diasporas, they can really, really significantly impact the nature of politics in Canada. And I want to really go into more depth as a really an example of how these people just claim whatever they want, and the media just happily pushes their claims. This is these graphics weren't the fanciest. This is back in 2021, but I really want to hammer to people back and then that there just isn't evidence for what they claim. They can't actually prove that these are agents of the Chinese government. There's no concept that, let's say that they actually were threatened. There's no concept that it could be an angry Chinese Canadian who's sick and tired of seeing their country slandered. And obviously I'm not endorsing harassment or threats. No, absolutely not. But no, there's no consideration even that could be a possibility, right? It always has to be the Chinese government, supposedly. And you just have, RCMP not actually pursuing these claims all the way because they don't have evidence, right? These people don't have evidence. They try to just claim they're not equipped, right? It's just claiming whatever they want, and the media will just push it. It's just excuses after excuses after excuses. And this is one of the most hilarious parts of the last little graphic I made, which is one of these anti-China Hong Konger groups. She had no evidence. It outright says she had no evidence, and yet the journalists just push that, and then it's the no evidence is a footnote, right? So you just have this entire trend, right, where these right-wing anti-communist diasporas claim intimidation by the governments of enemy nations, with the Canadian mainstream media just uncritically publishing these claims. There's actually a reason for it. At the end of the day, the mainstream media in Canada is a servant of the Canadian capital more broadly. And so some will publish narratives that are more favorable to the Conservatives. Some will publish narratives that are more favorable to the Liberals, depending on who's in government, what the geopolitical circumstances are. But at the end of the day, they all serve Canadian capital, and Canadian capital has the interest of demonizing Nicaragua, let's say, Cuba, China, right, and many of these other enemy nations. This is, inherently why it happens. And I want to get into the broader idea of Canada and its utilization of immigration as a weapon to enforce the political status quo and to also shift this country to the right, and at minimum keep it to the center, but also really opening the door to shifting the political atmosphere more and more rightward. So in more of the present day, you have this push to support Uyghur quote-unquote refugees who are it's all this hysteria around supposed Xinjiang genocide, which has been proven to be a nonsense hysteria. Even the U.S. government refuses to classify it as genocide. And you had Samir Zuberi, one of these Liberal MPs, pushing for the immigration of 10,000 Uyghurs. And eventually, in 2023, of course, February of this year, you actually had Canada vote to take in these Uyghur refugees. I say quote-unquote Uyghur refugees. And let's also look a little deeper. Back after the World War II, you actually had the Canadian government admitting more than 2,000 Ukrainian members of the Nazi 14th SS Division in the 1950s. And as my article back a couple years ago explained, this was done to crush the burgeoning leftist Ukrainian diaspora that was building up during the previous years. And they were utilized to crush leftist labor organizing. So I want people to understand in terms of historical Canadian utilization of immigration, even further than what I mentioned in terms of post-World War II, there's this particular eye-catching part I want to highlight, that the Canadian immigration officials particularly relied on the International Refugee Organization, which, quote, was fully aware of the extent of SS membership in Estonia and Latvia, end quote, according to Margolian. He further noted that, quote, collaborators from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union would have often evaded detection. So there's a knowledge of this. And then you had, with this knowledge of how many Estonians were collaborating with the Nazis, a relatively small country gave the SS an entire division. There was a push to get them in. You had, of course, 5,000 coming in from Sweden alone. You had C.D. Howes, who was one of the Canadian government cabinet members, dictating that Canadian immigration teams were not to disqualify Baltic veterans of the German army, that is, of course, the Nazis, unless there was clear evidence they had been volunteers. And the checking way of this was quite weak. And then, even that method is very poor because it was a question of joining before December 1st, 1943, but they could just, quote unquote, convince the immigration officials that they're conscripted because the Canadian political class really wanted cheap European labor. You also had hundreds of Estonians being able to sneak past immigration screening, and you had thousands of other Estonians doing a similar thing. They got the minimal screening procedure as described before. And it was only like a couple of years later, by August 1949, where the Canadian government finally punished people for actually avoiding the immigration process. And then most people may not understand is that by 1950, voluntary service in the regular, quote-unquote, regular German armed forces, of course that is the Nazis, was no longer considered grounds for automatic rejection. That's a free-for-all for Nazis to come into Canada, by 1950. This is, part of the way that the Nazi collaborators, rabid anti-communists, that they were able to get into Canada. It was because the Canadian government was very happy to have them, because they had a use of labor and they also had a use of battering down the more progressive elements of these diaspora communities, whether it's Ukrainians, Estonians. In total, you had, as Valery Kilko noted in an article from Canfiles, you had almost 35,000 followers of the infamous Nazi collaborator Stepan Bandera. They were able to immigrate to Canada. These people that cooperated with Nazis and, like I said, loved a brutal mass murderer, a brutal anti-Semite. So these are the kind of people that Canada willingly lets into the country, and it benefits the Canadian political elites. It benefits the status quo. It protects it from any potential of a burgeoning left, because you can simply overwhelm the progressive elements of diasporas, even those from enemy countries or ever else. You can overwhelm them by bringing in so many of these right wingers. Now, of course, this isn't true for every diaspora. Generally, the Palestinian diaspora is absolutely not supporting Israel, for example, right? That's an absolute firm line. You think of the Yemeni community. The Yemeni community is not en masse in Canada. It's not en masse supporting the Western war to keep Yemen separated, and the Saudi U.S.-led war on Yemen that seems to be almost done. It seems to be finally being ended. But it isn't that every single diaspora does, but this particularly from the enemy governments, right? Supposedly enemy governments, the people that are imported or immigrated, majority of them are anti-communist, and the Canadian government is, of course, going to lean towards and want those people and actively, seek out those people because they benefit the Canadian status quo. They, like I said, prevent the growth of the left by really outnumbering them. And then, well, that opens the door to intimidation of the left. I really just want to emphasize one point here. This is back in the earlier article. One way of getting into post-war Canada, quote, was by showing the SS tattoo, end quote. Canadian historian Irving Abella told 60 Minutes interviewer Mike Wallace in 1997. This proved that you were anti-communist. And let's get back into the focus, though, of course, which is the hysterical coverage of Evan Dyer and Cuba. There's been this broader bid to demonize the Cuban government, as I went into earlier with the rights group, but even recently there's been a concerted push. There's this constant claims of intimidation, like I said, harassment of these Cuban-Canadians who are opposed to the government. And then you had a March 6th Evan Dyer article, which really got hammered very hard for good reason, where there was actually a push to relay the Great Replacement theory, as pointed out correctly by Scott Martin. Just want to emphasize this here. It's this Great Replacement narrative, and it's really, really dangerous. It's just white supremacist propaganda, right? And it's pushed by someone like Evan Dyer. It's the trend where he's been pushing BS narratives in terms of anyone that's an enemy nation in Latin America, Central America. Just going to scroll through for a few seconds just so people get a chance to read through this. It's truly a terrible thing, The claim, especially that Cuba and Nicaragua are coordinating a plan to funnel migrants towards U.S. and Canada. Without evidence, he claims this. You just have all these anti-communist elements that are, like I said, given that space because those anti-communist diaspora, those anti-communists, those right-wing, those Nazi sympathizers, any of these are very, very useful for the Canadian state's purposes. It's just a truly horrifying thing to watch because, as I mentioned before, this utilization of immigration as a weapon to maintain a status quo has been actually incredibly effective, right? And it produces a situation where, realistically, there's this talk about Canadian left, the peace-loving left being a majority, silent one that couldn't organize effectively. No. The reality is, we're not a majority. Actually, we're not in any sort of way. We're actually a small minority. That has to be grappled with. That has to be grappled with as a reality. These, like I said, anti-communist, Nazi sympathizing, right-wing, extreme diaspora people have been immigrated en masse ever since the end of World War II, and now we're in the situation we are, where we're thoroughly outnumbered because of overall consistent policy of Canadian government, and have the interests of Canadian capital being to have a standing force of rabid anti-communists that would push back against any sort of the left movement, right? It's a dangerous situation we find ourselves in. And most of all, I want to warn, the solidarity folks for Cuba that this kind of article in the last few Dyer articles are very much the pattern of what happened to the reputation of China, right? In Canada, it used to be more positive, and you had these more and more claims of intimidation pushed, and they were given more and more space over time. And that's convenient. That's my view, very much an intentional thing. Is you slowly, you chipped away. They chipped away at the reputation of China, and this is happening with Cuba now. You have ever since the short-lived riots in July of 2021, there's been this push ever since. Democratic spaces pushing and such, working with the senator to demand diplomatic recognition be shifted to the opposition anti-government forces. These hysterical Dyer claims, it all leads to Cuba being really aggressively demonized. The comfortable place that Cuba solidarity movements have held in the sense of favorable Canadian policy towards mostly favorable. They haven't opposed the blockade, so it's obviously not good policy, but it's at least far less aggressive than the U.S. has been towards Cuba, that's over. We're in a new age, and there has to be adaptation to that. All right, folks, thanks for watching this video. If you folks enjoyed this analysis and work, feel free to share it with your friends, share it with your fellow activists, and if you appreciate the Canada Files journalism, please feel free to set up a monthly donation or an annual donation to support the Canada Files journalism. Have a great day. Goodbye.